Hello everyone, and today we'll be going over chapter 11 on Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. The chapter is entitled The Totalitarian Movement. In the previous chapter, we went over the classless society. This is the people that totalitarian movements recruit from. In this chapter, we discuss how these totalitarian movements both use propaganda to recruit these people, as well as how they organize them into a single mass. According to Arendt, propaganda is only used against the masses. This is in contrary to the mob or the elite. According to Arendt, the mob and the elite are already won over by being a part of a movement that has momentum. Now, as a quick refresher, the masses are those people who didn't really get involved with politics until they felt rootless and homeless within the world. The masses join the movement not for any kind of substance or doctrine, but in order to be a part of the movement itself. They want to be part of something that is greater than themselves. For more details on this, I'd recommend going back to the previous chapter, chapter 10. Now, according to Arendt, organized violence is the most efficient way for actualizing a doctrine in a totalitarian movement. However, this can't be done until the totalitarian movement is already in absolute power. When the country is still in a constitutional government and the people aren't atomized, then violence only has a limited effect. And violence isn't really used as a way to create terror in the opponents of the movement as much as it is to realize the doctrines of the movement itself. For example, when the Nazis liquidated a greater part of the Polish intelligentsia, they didn't do it because the Polish intelligentsia was against the movement itself, but because part of their doctrine was that the Polish people were an inferior race to begin with. The movement, to feel superior and infallible, must make sure that whatever it says must come true in some way. And part of the doctrine of the Nazis was that they were a part of the superior race and all other races were on the decline, and thus what they were doing was really just expediting what was going to happen in the first place. But what is the reason why the Nazis at all feel like they need to attack the Polish intelligentsia? According to Arendt, this propaganda, this making of doctrines, is necessary because a totalitarian movement lives in a non-totalitarian world. Propaganda is used as a means towards winning the loyalty of those who have not yet been initiated into the movement. In a sense, it's outward-facing. It's not directed towards people who have already been sympathizers of the movement as much as it's to win more people into that group of sympathizers. In a way, it's a foreign policy. Now, in Arendt's words, propaganda is directed towards an external sphere. This external sphere is made up of anybody who has not yet accepted the true aims of the movement itself. But this external sphere isn't just including the people who are outside the movement itself, it includes people who are also party members of the movement who simply just haven't yet accepted the true aims of the movement, which, to the Nazis at least, was the extermination of the Jews. Propaganda has really achieved its mission when Hitler says, "We will exterminate the Jews," no one really bats an eye. Now, sometimes information within the movement, the indoctrination, and the information outside the movement, the propaganda, comes into conflict. So if you are a member of the party who has accepted the aims of the Nazi doctrine and you see that propaganda is seen as some kind of a lie, instead of basically questioning the propaganda itself, you accept the propaganda as simply a means to win over people. It's basically like a trade. Propaganda is therefore an instrument. It has nothing to do with truth, and it's really only to drum up support for the movement. In essence, propaganda is a function of the external sphere as a means to achieve psychological aims. According to Arendt, terror is the counterpoint of propaganda. When the totalitarian movement has won enough people to its side, it can discard propaganda and use terror as a way to achieve its doctrines. Unlike military dictatorships that use terror against its enemies to instill fear, totalitarian movements use terror on its own people. For example, in the early stages of the Nazi Party, the Nazis committed murders of different parties, small party leaders, to basically instill kind of a terror in its own people. Now, the authorities and the police of the German government at that time did not prosecute the Nazis. And thus this instilled two different fears in the people. One, not to join any other party but the Nazis, and also it showed that the Nazis had more authority than the government itself. The Nazis even publicly acknowledged these murders. They weren't hiding it at all. According to Arendt, this behavior is highly similar and reminiscent of gangsterism. Now, this doesn't mean the Nazis were gangsters, but it means that they learned something from the American gangster business. What it adds up to is that the threats are not so much against individual people, but the threats are made for anyone who doesn't take part in the movement itself. That by not taking the side of the movement, that you are rejecting the progress of history itself, and that you are therefore part of a dying race. According to Arendt, this type of propaganda appeals to a scientific nature that is also very similar to what we see in American commercials, capitalist commercials today. She references what might be seen as a soap advertisement, that when you buy soap, it gives you scientific evidence to justify how superior it is. According to Arendt, the Nazis used a similar argument against the non-totalitarian world, that the Nazis were scientifically superior and all other races were simply in decline. According to Arendt, this type of propaganda is really only useful when the totalitarian movement has not gained power yet. Once they've gained power, they can throw this type of propaganda aside. Now, there are differences between Nazi propaganda and mass advertisement. In advertisements, the spokesperson does not claim to be a prophet in any way. They cite the facts, but they don't feel it necessary to demonstrate the actual truth. Mass propaganda, on the other side, insists that it must have a full demonstration. Quote, spokesmen pretend that they have discovered the hidden forces that will bring them good fortune in the chain of fatality. According to Tocqueville, it's these absolute systems which represent all the events in history as depending upon the great first causes linked by a chain of fatality, and which, as it were, suppress men from the history of the human race. For the Nazis, it meant conforming to the laws of history and basically defining the Aryan race. For Stalin, it was about recognizing the laws of history as class struggle and conforming to the dialectical materialism that determined history. For totalitarian propaganda, it uses this kind of pseudo-scientific nature and uses those kinds of statements as predictions for the future. And according to Arendt, what's essential about making such scientific predictions is that they can't be validated at the present moment in time, but instead must be validated at some future point. Thus, once some kind of prophetic statement is made, like the Jews are going to be exterminated, it doesn't have to happen now, but it's up to the party through organized violence to make that happen and to basically actualize that doctrine. According to Arendt, this type of prediction making wasn't invented by the totalitarian movements. Instead, it stems from 16th century time during the Enlightenment, during the time when mathematics really started making an impact on the world. According to Arendt, the process that started back in the 16th century has basically ended where totalitarianism has started. Quote, science has become an idol that will magically cure the evils of existence and transform the nature of man. It's almost as if science and rationality is the savior of man. We just need to basically uncover what scientific laws govern history. There are many different theories at this time of how this is actualized. Positivism states that the future is eventually scientifically predictable and rests on the evaluation of interest as an all-pervasive force. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, doesn't think that there's any kind of objective interest that we need to conform to. Instead, interest can be made and designed. We can see this idea similarly represented in the last of the 19th century with the advent of nihilism, where morality is not some objective thing that is discovered, but a relativistic morality is something that is created. Now, when totalitarianism worked in this anti-utilitarian way, it was a great shock to contemporary politics, because it wasn't really conforming to the interest of the people, yet it was still gaining power. Quote, the success of totalitarian propaganda does not rest so much on its demagoguery as on the knowledge that interest as a collective force can be felt only where stable social bodies provide the necessary transmission belts between the individual and the group. Thus, it's not the morally virtuous evaluations of deeds that determine what is right and wrong. What's right and wrong is determined by how the mass people, the mass bodies, evaluate it themselves. Or stated another way, it's not as if we think hard enough, we'll eventually get to the final objective laws of morality. Morality is determined by who you're around. And the morals of a movement can be so radical such that people in the movement can think that it'd be good that they sacrifice themselves for the purpose of the movement. This can be seen when the Nazis used the slogan at the end of the war, "or else we shall go down," meaning that if they lost, then they'd be willing to kill themselves because nothing else is worth living for. According to Arendt, in the last months of the war, the Nazis even started designing ways to kill a lot of people because the destruction of Nazi Germany meant the destruction of the world, and so they wanted an easy way to go out. Now, one point I'm going to probably repeat multiple times during this, but it's very important to repeat, is that the propaganda that totalitarian movements use, the importance of the propaganda is not itself the content of the propaganda, but the nature that it is infallible, and that it's consistent, and that it happens. For the masses in a world that felt like it was being kind of taken apart and that was unpredictable, they needed to latch onto something that was consistent, something that could be successful. And thus, what the most important thing was that these predictions came to being. They were infallible. Quote, "The form of infallible prediction in which these concepts were presented has become more important than their content. The chief qualification of a mass leader has become unending infallibility. He can never admit an error." So the mass leaders, like Hitler, their most important quality is that they make sure what they say actually comes true. So when Hitler says, "I want today once again to make a prophecy in case the Jewish financiers succeed once more in hurling the people into a world war, the result will be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe," what he actually means is that he will eventually exterminate the Jews from Europe. In this way, by making these predictions, what the totalitarian movements achieve is that they're simply reading off of the secret hidden forces of history and actualizing what was going to happen already. As soon as the executions happen, the prophecy simply becomes a retrospective alibi. Quote, "Then all debate about the truth or falsity of a totalitarian dictator's prediction is as weird as arguing with a potential murderer whether his future victim is dead or alive." And the more that the movement could prove that it could execute and be successful with whatever it stated to be prophecy, the more that the masses joined the movement because, again, they were rootless and homeless and looking for something that they could cling to that would be constant. Therefore, what's really important about the propaganda is not its content as much as it is that it happens, that it is infallible. According to Arendt, even the content of the propaganda is nothing that the totalitarian movements invented in the first place. It took themes 50 years prior from the mob about anti-Semitism. It was something that the Nazis really just recycled because that was what would galvanize the people the most. They took those issues put forward by the mob that the government itself was a large corrupt body. That the real truth, that what was really happening was not what was being said in public, but what was not being said in public. This mob would rather believe in conspiracy theories than take part in politics that was dealing with issues of the contemporary time period. Quote, "They do not believe in anything visible, in the reality of their own experience. They do not trust their eyes and ears, but only their imaginations, which may be caught by anything that is at once universal and consistent in itself." Totalitarian propaganda strives to escape reality into a fiction world. It's the consistency of the story that they tell that determines the reliability of the fictional world itself. And according to Arendt, this is the inevitably weak part of totalitarian propaganda. The doctrines that they speak of in the propaganda don't necessarily align with common sense. It's thus up to common sense's ability to take apart the propaganda and realize what it really is. She gives an example, so to say, that in ancient times, the Bible was written by 70 different scribes and they all came to the same writing exactly. Now, if you were using your common sense, you would say that that is a miracle. That is really no possible way this could happen. If you were in a conspiracy theory, that would be proven as evidence of such the mystical qualities of the Bible itself. Quote, "While it is true that the masses are obsessed by a desire to escape from reality because in their essential homelessness they can no longer bear its accidental, incomprehensible aspects, it is also true that their longing for fiction has some connection with those capacities of the human mind whose structural consistency is superior to mere occurrence." In a way, masked man needs a fictional world that can be as strongly justified as reality itself. Thus, the force of totalitarian movements can be measured by their ability to alienate people from the real world. According to Arendt, only the sore spots, or those places where people don't speak of in public, like the Jewish question, are the only bridges back to reality. And these sore spots attach to all political and social aspects of society. Quote, "Revelations of scandals in high society, of corruption of politicians, everything that belongs to yellow journalism becomes in their hands a weapon of more than sensational importance." Now, the greatest conspiracy theory that the Nazis used was targeted at the Jewish question. And what they said is that the Jews had actually already created a secret society that dominated the world, that kind of pulled the strings in the background. The more out of sight this topic was, nobody really made it public, the more mysterious it was, and the more that those conspirator theories could believe that was actually true. Even more so, this concept was not new. This was known 50 years back, even in the Dreyfus Affair. But it became especially conspicuous when the Jews lost their actual functioning roles in the government. Quote, "The point about the Jews themselves is that they grew prominent and conspicuous in inverse proportion to their real influence and position of power." I also recommend going back to the first section of the book, which I've also made videos about, to understand anti-Semitism in the context of the 19th century. Now, what the Nazis did that was unique is that they made the Jewish question a personal question. It demanded that if you wanted to be a part of the party, you had to prove back to 1750 that you had not had any Jewish ancestry. Thus, being not Jewish became an identity for the movement itself. It was this aspect that gave masked man sort of a own self-respect. But it wasn't actually that the Nazis hated the Jews, they actually admired the Jews. It's because the Nazis believed that the Jews had already established a secret society that was dominating the world, a position that they wanted to be in. The Nazis thus saw the Jewish race as a competitor to their own. Their admiration was so strong that when Hitler said what is right for the German people, was actually taken from the document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which stated, "Everything that benefits the Jewish people is morally right and sacred." Now, this document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was actually a forged document, had nothing to do with the Jews, but it told a story that the Jews had already dominated the world. This document proved as the fictional justification for the Nazis the fact that the Jews had been pulling strings in the background of all world powers. Quote, "This forgery was mainly used for the purpose of denouncing the Jews and arousing the mob to the dangers of Jewish domination." And as inferred in the protocols, the point of the domination was not to get control of any single one country, but was world domination. And this is exactly what the Nazis wanted. Quote, "Nazi propaganda, in other words, discovered the supernatural because intensely national Jew, the forerunner of the German master of the world, and assured the masses that the nations that have been the first to see through the Jew and have been the first to fight him are going to take his place in the domination of the world." In fact, Himmler once said, "We owe the art of government to the Jews." And the existence of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion convinced the Nazis that the conquest of the world wasn't just a dream, but was an actuality. The Nazis established the Volksgemeinschaft, a community which separated itself from the rest of the world, just as the Jews had separated themselves from the rest of the world. This community claimed that all Germans were equal and everybody else was not. According to Arendt, this community was only a stepping stone to the Aryan race, which would later become part of the Nazi movement. Now, what is most important for the totalitarian movement is, again, not the content of the propaganda, but the organization of the people around the propaganda, around the doctrines. Quote, "The true goal of totalitarian propaganda is not persuasion, but organization, the accumulation of power without the possession of the means of violence." And again, the Nazis never created any new doctrines. All they did, everything that was new, was simply a way of organizing people around doctrines. And what distinguished the success of the leader of the totalitarian movements was not so much the oratorical speeches that he gave. It did help, but according to Arendt, what was most important was his selection of doctrines such that he could gather up a mass of people that would support the movement. Quote, "What distinguishes the totalitarian leaders and dictators is rather the simple-minded, single-minded purposefulness with which they choose those elements from existing ideologies, which are best fitted to become the fundaments of another entirely fictitious world." Now, in order to realize their kind of racial ambitions, they need to make this fictitious world, a world in which individual experience doesn't really have any effect. That everything that is a part of this fictitious world can only be affected by what is hidden. And thus, through propaganda, this fictitious world competes with actual reality. And the fictitious world can only be as convincing as it is consistent. Any contradiction within the fictitious world ultimately will undermine its legitimacy. Quote, "Once these propaganda slogans are integrated into a living organization, they cannot be safely eliminated without wrecking the whole structure." Thus, the Jewish conspiracy theory wasn't simply something that could be argued about. It was at the rudimentary part of the whole Nazi propaganda. Every propaganda that was given by the Nazis already assumed that the Jewish conspiracy theory was true, thus it couldn't be argued in the first place. In questioning the idea of this Jewish conspiracy theory would either be something that would be completely not believed or an assault on the movement itself. Thus, racism wasn't a kind of debatable theory of scientific value. It was realized every day, became obvious, not even to question it. To question the Jewish dominance or the Aryan physiognomy added up to questioning the existence of the world itself. But through which force was this idea supported? Well, again, according to Arendt, it's built upon the unquestioning masses. Quote, "Without the force of the movement, its members cease at once to believe in the dogma for which yesterday they were ready to sacrifice their lives." Without the masses of people, without them shouting and believing fully in the movement itself, the movement would not have any force. And if one day everything grew quiet and the movement sank into nothingness, then everybody would kind of wake up from just like a really bad dream, I guess. It would be inevitable that the masses, who were so caught up in the Jewish conspiracy, would rather look elsewhere for a strong voice and admit that their previous membership was simply a bad bet. And according to Arendt, this is why it was so hard to find self-claimed Nazis at the end of the war. Once the movement was gone, everybody that had once affiliated themselves with the movement no longer supported it. Now, in this first section, Arendt talks about the propaganda that the movement used. In the second section, we're going to talk about the way that it organized people within the movement. Now, again, the purpose of the organizations are to make the fictional world of the propaganda into a functioning reality. It is to make that fictional world seem as real as reality itself. And to do this, it needs to take those doctrines that seem so radical and give them a hint of normalcy. So much to the point that when this racial doctrine is claimed, people will not really react so negatively towards it. And to do this, the movement really needs to convince the masses that this fictional world, where these radical ideas that would be seen in the normal world are actually normal, and you shouldn't care so much about it. Now, according to Arendt, in the Nazi movement, organization and propaganda are two sides of the same coin. The most striking organizational device in the pre-power part of the totalitarian movement is something Arendt calls front organizations. Now, front organizations can be thought as a kind of buffer between different layers of the organization. They surround the movement with a protective wall and thus isolate the party of the movement itself from the normal world. For example, a front organization might divide the party of the movement, the Nazi party, from the sympathizers. Now, what's important about this is that the people in the Nazi party, through the front organizations, will always kind of interact with those who are in the less kind of radical part of that front organization, which is the sympathizers. Now, what's important about this is that the Nazis, since they're surrounding themselves with people who are like-minded, will not see their acts as so radical. Quote, "They form a bridge back into normalcy, without which the members in the pre-power stage would feel too sharply the differences between their beliefs and those of normal people, between the lying fictitiousness of their own and the reality of the normal world." Now, according to Arendt, Hitler used front organizations in a unique way, such that he divided the sympathizers of the movement, of the party, such that there was a majority of sympathizers, much more people, and there was a minority of party members. And when Hitler made policies, what he did is that he made sure that the policies would increase the population of the sympathizers while restricting the population of the party members. This creates an effect that there are so many people who have beliefs for the movement that if you are a part of the party, then you wouldn't really question some orders that are sent down through the ranks when you receive them. It seems so normal since there are so many people that are already supporting the movement itself, and thus since you are part of the movement, what the movement says must be right in some way. Quote, "For the fellow traveler has the same convictions, after all, albeit in a more normal, less fanatical, confused form." Now, as you get more involved with the movement, you might move into different ranks that are even more radical, and this pattern of front organizations is repeated. So you have the sympathizers with the party members, and then you might have a front organization between the party members and the elite, which is an even smaller group and having more radical ideas within the organization. What this does is that it creates a sense of normalcy through the layers, so that what might seem radical to the normal world outside of the totalitarian movement might seem normal for people in the totalitarian movement. And according to Arendt, the normal world sees the totalitarian movement only through the front organization of the sympathizers. So they only see the totalitarian movement as much as it is the least fanatical. The sympathizer looks innocent. They could hardly be called fanatics, but it's through them, through their blind acceptance of their movement's doctrines, that enables the evil that results later on. Okay, but how do front organizations actually work? Quote, "The front organization functions both ways, as a facade of the totalitarian movement to the non-totalitarian world, and as a facade of this world to the inner hierarchy of the movement." Again, so if we have different layers, where as you get more into the movement, the more kind of radical ideas are seen normal, you have a kind of sense of normalcy that exists between front organizations. So in the Nazi movement, you had first the sympathizers that represented a basically majority of the people who were within the movement. From there, you went to the party members, who are a limited, restricted number of people. From there, you go to the elite organization, who are even more restricted. And finally, after the elite organization, there is another front organization, which is called the inner circle, which is the ones who actually work directly with the leader. At each layer, a more radical degree of normalcy is accepted. This is why Hitler can say he aims to kill the Jews, and then no one will really bat an eye. And why is it normal? Well, it's because the movement has created this fictitious world where it should be normal. It's not normal in the sense of the world outside of the totalitarian movement. Another important factor of the organization is that it clearly distinguishes between those who are in the movement and those who are outside the movement. Quote, a definite advantage of this structure is that it blunts the impact of one of the basic totalitarian tenets, that the world is divided into two gigantic hostile camps. Thus, the totalitarian movements reinforce this idea of an us versus them mentality. And this us versus them mentality is repeated throughout the movement. Thus, it continually is able to create more and more layers that are more radical. And if something needs to be done according to the leader, and there is no group that is really radical enough, then more front organizations need to be created in order to find the people necessary that they will do their duty, do their orders without any kind of questioning. And this is what happened with the Nazis. The SA formed a militant group out of the party membership in 1922. The SS was formed out of the SA in 1926 into an even more radical militant group. And finally, the shock troops were made in 1940, which was formulated out of the SS, an even more militant group. Thus, if in a pre-power stage of the movement Hitler said he wanted to exterminate all the Jews, he wouldn't have the necessary people in place in order to really conduct that. And since the movement is built off of the consistency that the leader does what he says, this would be basically an undermining of the movement itself. It's only until you have multiple layers of indoctrination that you're able to really conduct these horrible acts. Quote, so long as the movement exists, its peculiar form of organization makes sure that at least the elite formations can no longer conceive of a life outside the closely knit band of men who, even if they are condemned, still feel superior to the rest of the uninitiated world. Now, in a separate essay, not in this book, Arendt makes the analogy of a totalitarian organization as an onion. So the outermost layer of the onion is kind of the least fanatic group, but supporters and sympathizers of the movement. And each layer represents a front organization, such that only the next layer touches the other layer. And as you get closer and closer towards the middle of the onion, you eventually have the leader and his inner circle. This organization is different than military dictatorships, where power is diffused through the hierarchy of command. Instead, with the Nazis, everything is given power through the Führer himself. The question thus becomes, how do we organize a movement such that all power resides in one person? Now, while the totalitarian movement isn't a military dictatorship, it does have some military aspects. For example, the Nazis take up a military aesthetic, basically dressing in uniforms, doing marches in the streets. But according to Arendt, these are merely rituals, and they're really just a fake army. Quote, somehow these uniforms eased considerably the consciousness of the murderers and also made them even more receptive to unquestioning obedience and unquestioned authority. According to Arendt, these rituals make the Nazis strikingly similar to secret societies. Similar to secret societies, they use idolatry to give an aura of religious significance. Quote, it is obvious that people are more securely held together through the common experience of a secret ritual than by the common sharing of the secret itself. And according to Arendt, this isn't by accident or coincidence. Both Hitler and Stalin were part of secret societies prior to their rise in leadership. Secret societies suppress dissident opinions and centralize absolute command. It creates a sharp divide between those people in the society and outsiders. Quote, the world at large loses all the nuances, differentiations, and pluralistic aspects, which had in any event become confusing and unbearable to the masses, who had lost their place and their orientation in it. What inspired them with the unwavering loyalty of members of secret societies was not so much the secret as the dichotomy between us and all others. Again, the Nazi claimed that the Aryan race is superior and is a living organization, and all other people outside of the movement are seen to be in decline and dying. And according to Arendt, the chief value of a secret society structure is not the loyalty inherent in it, but instead the safeguard of a fictitious world through consistent lying. Now, the Nazis were also perceivably militaristic in another way, and this is through their paramilitary. The Nazis used this group to be a duplicate of the other current existing military in the country. The reason this was set up was once the Nazis took power, they could simply switch the two organizations. They could destroy the existing military structure and just replace it with their own military program. And they didn't only do this with military organizations either. They did this with student and teacher organizations. They did this with cultural organizations. This is the process of duplication, which is what Arendt calls it. Quote, "The important factor for the movements is that even before they seize power, they give the impression that all elements of society are embodied in their ranks. The ultimate goal of the Nazi propaganda was to organize the whole German people as sympathizers." And thus this technique of duplication resulted in the destruction of many institutes within the country. When the Nazis came to power, they could simply discard these old institutions. And thus, once the Nazis took power, the task of the paramilitary was basically complete. Quote, "In this respect, the function of the elite formations is the very opposite of that of the front organizations. While the latter lend the movement an air of respectability and inspire confidence, the former, by extending complicity, makes every party member aware that he has left for good the normal world, which outlaws murder, and that he will be held accountable for all crimes committed by the elite." According to Arendt, organized violence is the most efficient way for protecting the fictitious world from the real world. It makes a member of the party fear leaving the movement rather than be complicit with conducting illegal acts. As long as they have support from the masses of people who don't really know what's going on, then they have the power to do what they will. And at the center of everything sits the leader. Quote, "His position within this intimate circle depends upon his ability to spin intrigues among its members and upon his skill to constantly change its personnel." According to Arendt, the leader owes his skill at being a leader for his ability to deal with intra-party struggles. Unlike other parts of the movement, he doesn't win by violence. Instead, he wins by becoming highly detailed in the personal affairs of people which are around him. According to Arendt, every member of his circle can be seen as someone who gained that position through the Führer himself. And in its full maturity, the movement establishes an unsaid law that the will of the Führer is the party's law. And at this point, the leader is basically irreplaceable. Once the party completely identifies with the leader, if they were to lose the leader, their reason would no longer exist. Quote, "The supreme task of the leader is to impersonate the double function characteristic of each layer of the movement, to act as the magic defense of the movement against the outside world, and at the same time to be the direct bridge by which the movement is connected with it. Even more so, the leader claims full responsibility for every deed and misdeed that happens in the totalitarian movement." According to Arendt, this is the most important organizational aspect of the leader principle. This is different than a military dictator who might blame an event on another person. Everything that happens in the movement, everything that is done, is a reflection of the leader. The leader is fully responsible for everything in totalitarian movements. This total responsibility that the leader assumes leads to the fact that no one in the movement feels responsible for their own actions. It's simply a matter of doing a duty, doing what is necessary. But if the leader is responsible for all these heinous crimes that happen, then how can the sympathizers who are not as fanatical actually trust the leader? According to Arendt, this is the true mystery of the leader, and she doesn't give an explanation for this. According to Arendt, in order to sustain the fictitious world that the totalitarian movement builds, each layer needs to have a mixture of gullibility and cynicism. In an incomprehensible world, the masses believed everything and nothing. Mass propaganda showed that the masses were ready to believe the worst, no matter how absurd it sounded. For the masses, everything was a lie anyway. Quote, "One could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. Thus, if the leader is proved wrong in some way, instead of trying to demand the truth from the leader, they would find some way to validate why the leader did what he did. And according to Arendt, the higher the rank of the totalitarian movement, the more you get deeply involved in the movement itself, the higher cynicism there is. It must be believed that the leader is able to predict with infallible measure everything that happens. And this doesn't mean that the leader knows the truth about everything, it just means that the leader is always right. Now, according to Arendt, the only group that is really supposed to believe everything that the leader says is the sympathizers, the people who are most outside of the movement but still part of it. Quote, without the organizational division of the movement into elite formations, membership, and sympathizers, the lies of the leader would not work. Quote, the point is that the sympathizers in front organizations despise their fellow citizens' complete lack of initiation. The party members despise the fellow citizens' gullibility and lack of radicalism. The elite formations despise, for similar reasons, the party membership. And within the elite formations, a similar hierarchy of contempt accompanies every new foundation and development. Thus, as you get closer and closer into the core of the movement, you have layers that believe that the previous layer is very gullible, and the layers that are more kind of in the center of the movement are the most cynical. Thus, the people who are closest to the leader are the most cynical and will therefore always find a way to justify their leader's decisions. And at the other end of the extreme, the sympathizers are the most gullible and they seem to believe in everything. Quote, its ingeniousness rests precisely on the elimination of that reality which either unmasks the liar or forces him to live up to his pretense. So Hitler, the leader of the Nazi Party, is never going to be put into a space where he's going to be questioned. Now, again, we said the propaganda that was created for the Nazi movement was only directed towards the sympathizers. The people in the party knew that the propaganda were lies for a reason of gaining more membership within the party. The party membership believed that Hitler had the keys to history, that he figured out those scientific laws that determined what was going to happen in the future. In a way, these party members needed a demonstration that Hitler was who he said he was. On the other hand, the elite formations, the next layer within the movement, did not need such demonstrations. Instead, its members' whole education is aimed at abolishing their capacity for distinguishing between truth and falsehood, between reality and fiction. Their superiority consists in their ability immediately to dissolve every statement of fact into a declaration of purpose. Thus, for the elites, when they say the Jews are inferior, that means to them that all Jews need to be killed. The elite can't experience facts as facts. They can't use their own individual experience to validate whether something is true or false. And in a way, the elite never stop and think what world they are currently in. Instead, they have unending loyalty to the leader and never question what is given to them by him. Finally, the topmost layer of the movement is the intimate circle, which works directly with the leader. This can be thought of as the entourage of Hitler. For them, the ideological statements of the movement are merely a means of organizing people. They don't believe that themselves. Quote, what binds these men together is a firm and sincere belief in a human omnipotence. Their moral cynicism, their belief that everything is permitted, rests on the solid conviction that everything is possible. These men are very few in number and can believe that really anything is possible. They put organization in order to gain power over any kind of substantial doctrine. For example, if the mob can rob a ill-guarded rich man, then that ought to happen. Quote, the point of their loyalty is not that they believe in the leader is infallible, but that they are convinced that everybody who commands the instruments of violence with the superior methods of totalitarian organization can become infallible. Thus, in this totalitarian organization, the will of power, kind of the results of the nihilistic world, comes to fruition. The success or failure of the totalitarian movement isn't determined by what happens, but instead how it is perceived by the masses of people that support the movement. Quote, in a totally fictitious world, failures need not be recorded, admitted, and remembered. factuality itself depends for its continued existence upon the existence of the non-totalitarian world. So that was chapter 11. I hope you enjoyed it. We have a few more chapters left, and then we'll be done with the book. I hope you're enjoying all of these. Please leave a comment below if you have anything to say. Otherwise, have a great day.